run a little bit later, so we can go till about 5:15. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we'll get started again. I hope you've all had a chance to witness Charwei's performance. And while everyone's settling in, I'm just going to quote Charwei briefly about the piece. She says, and this is not quite how it worked, but I'm going to say it anyway and give you something to think about as the panelists are speaking. I view this performance as a kind of group meditation. The presence of the audience definitely makes a difference. I'm quoting Charwei. I can feel their focus while observing the writing process, and it helps me to concentrate more. In these situations, I can sometimes visualize each character from my heart, through my arms, to my hands, followed by a manifestation on paper in brush and ink. The process of making the work has always been the most important part of my practice, so I'm always glad when people are interested in participating in the process. So, Charwei, thank you so much for the Heart Sutra for us. So our next panel looks at modern Buddhism, contemporary art, and the Asian diaspora. And by modern Buddhism, I'm referring to those forms of Buddhism that are adapted to the contemporary context and contending with forces of globalization and various issues in modern society. So we're no longer so easily able to talk about Buddhism and national or cultural identity, but we are witnessing a time where Buddhism and its modes of practice and its cultural expressions are being reconfigured so as to be transnational, plural, syncretic, or hybrid and transcultural, to use a term from anthropology that's gaining greater relevance in the field of art history and curatorial practice. So this panel looks at how Buddhist cultural and philosophical influences have informed the work of artists of Asian background working in the North American context. The panel examines immigrant and diasporic practices, generational and intergenerational shifts in practice, producing new communities of practitioners adapting Buddhist concepts and values to new cultural and creative contexts. Our moderator is Tzu-I Chung. Tzu-I is a cultural and social historian broadly interested in transnational migration and Asian diaspora in North America within the historical context of artistic, cultural, and economic exchanges between North America and the Asia Pacific. Buddhist practices have been an integral part of Tzu-Yi's cultural upbringing. She is a curator of history at the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, just down the street. And her curatorial project, the Centre of Arrivals, is part of the museum's long-term commitment towards the representation of intercultural community histories and museum engagement. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for being here. And thanks Hema and the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria for this really unique forum for all these diverse participants. Over the past months, I had the pleasure of going through the artists' portfolios and some of their ideas. These artists have already exchanged some of the ideas in writing as well. And I'm not going to read their full bios because they have specifically asked to have more time with the audience. So we are hoping that we can open up the last half an hour at least to encourage you to have a full discussion with these artists. I would say one thing, though, these are really accomplished artists who have worked across different continents. So I'm going to go over a little bit of basics in case you haven't read their bios, but their full bios are in the program, but also they each have their own website that I would encourage you to check out because I really enjoyed checking them out. So going by the most boring alphabetical order. Farheen HaQ is a South Asian Muslim Canadian artist, and she's been living here on unceded Laiwan territory for 20 years. She was born and raised on Haudenosaunee, Shawnee territory in the Niagara region in Ontario among a tight-knit Muslim community. And her national and international engagements have included basically her artworks have traveled to New York, Paris, Buenos Aires, Lahore, Hungary, Romania, and recently in Colombia, New York, Vancouver Island, Miami, and of course a lot of other places. So if you want to check it out, check her website. And she received her fine arts and MFA in, training in Canada. The second artist, Tomoyo Ihaya, she was born and raised in Mie, Japan, and she became a resident of Canada since 2000. And again, she has very full, she received her full artistic training in Canada and then went around in different places across different continents in India, Mexico, Thailand, the US, Canada, Taiwan, South Korea, and most recently very much engaged with India as well. And other than these places, she lives in Vancouver. The third artist, Laiwan, she is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, educator. She was born in Zimbabwe to Chinese parents, and they immigrated to Canada in 1977. She received her fine arts training also in Canada, and she has done work in Canada, US, and Zimbabwe, and she also does a lot of urban and social engaged art in all kinds of different places. And I would encourage you again to check her website. There are some really interesting urban engagement projects that I was really intrigued by. The last but not least, Charwei Tsai that we just saw performing. She was born in Taiwan and currently lives and works in Taipei, but she received her education in North America and also Paris. And of course, her works have taken her to all kinds of different places, Bogota, Hong Kong, London, Mumbai, Paris, Singapore, Sydney, Taipei, and Tokyo, and a lot of other places. And there are a wide variety of arts projects that are listing her bios. And again, I encourage you to check out her more in detail on her website. But today we are going to start with a simple question of the artist's practice of art and practice of Buddhism. So as a way of introducing yourself, if you can speak to us about your practice of art, and is that an extension of your practice of Buddhism, or how would you describe their roles in your life and their relationships? We're going to start with a different artist for each question. So, okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Oh, it's loud. Such a pleasure to be here amongst new friends and old friends. And thank you for the introduction, Tzu-I. And thank you, Hema, for the invitation and for organizing this convening. The question is...
Practice of art, practice of Buddhism.
Okay, so perfect. So thank you. Just needed to hear it again. So my practices, pretty much when I come to the kind of foundation of what drives or informs my work, it would be this question of like, who am I? Or the kind of the big questions of personal inquiry. And I've been practicing Buddhism actively for about the last 14 years. And I came to Buddhist practice with my first pregnancy. I have 2 children. And it came at a time when there was a big body change for me, and it was a big life transition. And I was called to practice in an intense way, and that's when I went to my first Vipassana retreat. But that embodiment and ability to practice and go on retreat marked the beginning of a way of deepening kind of my contemplative practice that has always informed my work. So coming back to that question of like, who am I? what does it mean to be here? What does it mean to be Muslim? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a mother? These are the questions that I was grappling with and that I bring into the studio with me. These are the questions I still grapple with. And I have found my contemplative practice, whether it's through Islam and mystical practices from my family around Sufism and chanting, or integrating in the last sort of 14 years Buddhist practice. The ability to embody a practice and encounter ritual have helped me immensely in how I work. So I often use my own body in my work as a way to understand and kind of probe these questions. And so the ability to sit with myself, to examine gesture, whether it's through repetition, whether it's through prostration and touching the ground, it's that kind of being able to detach and watch myself inhabiting gestures. That's what I do in my meditation practice, in my prayer practice, and in my art practice. So they're completely intertwined, and one informs the other, informs the other. Yeah, and I think it's the ability to be really embodied, and particularly within Buddhism, the languaging around embodied practice and awareness of senses, and the way that I've learned from teachers in the Theravada tradition around watching the body and watching thoughts have been a huge complementary sort of gateway into understanding how culture lives in the set of conditions and experiences, which I'm trying to understand through my work. So in consideration of time, I'll pass it along, but that's a beginning.
Hi, so I'm from Taiwan, and so I guess Taiwan is when I was growing up in Taiwan, it was mostly a Buddhist country. So I grew up in a Buddhist environment, but in Taiwan it's also very mixed with Taoism and Confucianism, like all religions, or three religions or philosophical traditions are very much mixed. So I think while I was growing up, I was more interested in the mystical and like the more superstitious aspects of like the rituals and the prayers and the temples. And also like in a lot of our Taoist temples, there's shamanism. And as I moved to the West, I was studying in the West, in the US. And I came across a Tibetan friend, and I was really intrigued by his presence and his liveliness. So after I graduated from school, I volunteered for Tibet House in New York. Then I got to study Buddhism, like a different side of Buddhism. Then I realized like the more I learned about Buddhism, the more I started to be interested in the logic part of the tradition, and it became easier actually for me to study in both languages, in both Chinese and in English, because in Chinese, since it's over a 1,000-year-old tradition, a lot of the texts were translated in a very ancient way of writing. So, and some parts, like in sutras, some parts are translated literally, and then some parts are translated phonetically from Sanskrit. So, in English, I'm able to understand it in a more colloquial way. And then my practice in art is kind of intertwined with my study of Buddhism. So I had the Heart Sutra memorized since when I was a kid. And so when I was younger, the way I learned the Heart Sutra was more like if I was scared, then I would recite it. And in a more like superstitious way, I didn't really understand the meaning at all. And then later on, I was working in New York for a Chinese artist, Tsai Chung. And I was writing, I told him about an idea of writing the Heart Sutra on a piece of tofu, which is ephemeral material, which is right here. So I wanted to kind of visualize the text about impermanence on ephemeral material. So there was an exhibition opportunity where an older artist or an established artist would recommend a younger artist in Paris. So he recommended me for this exhibition. I got accepted. And because Tsai, people who know him, he likes to work on really large scale. So he encouraged me to find like as big piece of tofu as I could. When in Paris, in Chinatown in Paris. And I had it custom made, and then to write, the sutra for this artwork. And because it was so big that I couldn't finish writing at the opening, so people started walking in, and they're, oh wow, a Chinese woman doing a performance. So then I started to get invited to do these performances, and that's how it evolved. Yeah, on different ephemeral things. So after this repetitive act of writing, I started to be more and more familiar with the sutra, and I feel like as life goes on, like as my life experience increases, I'm understanding the text even more. So it's through my art practice that I feel like I'm going deeper into my understanding of Buddhism. And then since then it evolved into social practice, which I'll talk about later.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, my name is Tomoyo Ihaya, and thank you, Hema, for inviting me here. We've been having a wonderful time. And thank you for everybody who helped to bring this event together. I feel very privileged and fortunate. I grew up in Japan in 70s, and I did grow up with my Buddhist family, and I bring up non-Buddhist metaphor, but Winnie the Pooh, and Eeyore. So I was Eeyore since I was born. I was very sad and introvert, and a little bit pessimistic. And I remember when I was little, I was always wondering, why am I here? What am I doing? Why I feel so sad? Yes? And I thought, what is to live? I remember it's not as a noble idea, but I was always wondering because it was not comfortable for me to be alive, seriously. And not that I was suicidal, but I was melancholic. So only two refuges for me where I find my a soft spot in my heart were drawing and reading books. Because my mother was a librarian. So we got a lot of books from different countries. And then they didn't give me toys. They give me lots of paper, crayons, color pencil. So to me, the inquiry about the reasoning of my existence and drawing, they came like this. It was not separable, because if I didn't draw, I become Eeyore. So, so not to feel like that, I had to keep drawing. And then about the Buddhist, Japan is known to be to have so many beautiful temples and beautiful tradition, older history of Buddhism. But around me, my grandparents are Buddhist, but they belong to a particular sect, which, and also kind of more Buddhism as just, how can I say, just a form, more like only rite. So not about teaching, but only about the custom. So for example, if my great grandfather died, I was very sad. It's first time I saw somebody dying at home. And then monks come. These 2 monks came to give a prayer. And then I still remember I was very upset because all the adult people, men sit in front of the altar after funeral, and women have to offer food. Yeah? And they even drink beer. And I remember the little child, why they are drinking beer after my great-grandfather died. So that's just one example, and I'm not saying all Buddhist monks or nuns are like that. But in a little community, the customs remains, pressure of doing that custom remained more than teaching itself, rather than doing inner practice, you know. In Buddhism, we walk on a path alone, supporting each other with your sangha, right? But it wasn't like that. So I felt such a rejection to Buddhism, actually. And then it was not till I went to university in Tokyo that I learned Eastern philosophy, talking about emptiness, sense of border, that I start being more curious about actual teaching. And when I came to Canada in 1994, and I came to America for just one term in 1996, luckily I met this soul sister who was still a wonderful artist, and she was a meditator. So she dragged me to Dharma talk and meditation, and I started inquiring inside. So like when I was a child, little Eeyore, went to draw in an art school. That's such an eye-opening experience for me because I could express whatever happening inside. But also this friend introduced me to meditation. And that's when teaching of Buddhism about transient nature, loving kindness, and if we believe in past and future life, all this gave me this big opening about how to live. And in Tibetan Buddhism, or even mine was Mahayana, but also she introduced me to Vipassana. In a prayer, it's always include, may we get enlightened in sake of all other beings. It's not about one's refuge, but it's also thinking of every sentient beings because we are interconnected. So it's really helped me to make art, not only philosophically, but also in terms of the attitude, because there's lots of competition or ego or self-expression. And I didn't feel comfortable to push myself as an artist because it didn't feel good. So making art with that, along with learning, really helped me to keep my mind rather sane. Yes, and then am I talking too much? And then sorry. And then I went to India to make a long story short. After that, to do meditation and artist residency, and that changed my life, like 360 degrees, because I met the Tibetan refugee people, and I learned the compassion, sharing suffering together by their direct action by my grandmothers. I carry them around with me whenever I go. And they taught me the language of ninja, means I feel your suffering, I feel your pain, compassion. Let's share this. Even I cannot understand your pain 100%, I still feel your pain. So that's how I do what I've been doing 7 years, become kind of social activism. Okay, thank you. Did I talk too much?
Thank you to my fellow panelists and Jaime for inviting me and all of you here today. Let's see. I was born in what was called Rhodesia, and it was governed by apartheid. My grandfather arrived in Rhodesia at the turn of the 1900s and sent for my father, who arrived soon after. Now, the Chinese in Rhodesia weren't allowed to own any land, and they weren't allowed any occupation other than being storekeepers. My father was a very bad storekeeper, and it's because he liked ideas. He didn't like being practical. And so there's something that was passed on to me, which was the love of poetics and the love of philosophy. And I thank my lineage for that. Within Rhodesia and apartheid and the violence of apartheid, I became very aware of, say, colonialism. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I live in Vancouver, which is the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. And I'm very thankful that I was given refuge in 1977 when we left the war in Rhodesia. My interest is really rooted in poetics and philosophy. And so the question for me is, in this moment, in this crisis that we're in, environmentally, politically, how can we move forward living the best way we can? So philosophically, I came to Buddhist teachings through that. The key thing that drives my work is liberation. And in what ways can we become free, to free ourselves from the various karmas that have constructed who we are today. I decided to focus my work on urban environmental issues because it came a point in my practice where I had nothing left to say. And I really didn't know whether to stay an artist. I actually gave up being an artist a couple of times. So for me, the question of land and acknowledging that the land that we're on, the colonial constructs in our relationship to land, and this is also in relation to our bodies. Now, within colonialism, growing up in Rhodesia, within apartheid, as a girl of color, as a queer girl of color, there are constructs that will remove me from my body. So a lot of my work has been how to come back to this body, love this body, and learn how to make peace, like an internal peace with perhaps even generational trauma. And so working through also chronic illness, coming to terms with a great sense of inner peace and emptiness, I'm now at a place where I'm wanting to listen to urban environments and see what surfaces. So there's a piece that's one of the slides called Fountain. So around 2012, there was an image that was haunting me, and for no good reason. I wasn't researching it, and it was a bridge over some water. In 2014, I got invited to do an artist residency at CBC for the Vancouver Foundation. And I went into the CBC archives and I said, "Do you know what this bridge is?" And the archivist came back and he gave me a film called Summer Afternoon. And the bridge is the Georgia Viaduct. And the Georgia Viaduct in Vancouver, when there used to be water under the viaduct, many of us didn't know that there was water there. I never knew there was water there. But in this 1956 film, 2 boys are running down the dock behind Chinatown, and there is this water under this bridge. For me, I was very interested in how we cover all of these waterways, and in what ways can we make cities flow? In what ways can we bring back the livelihoods of, say, salmon that are living, who are born to these streams that are now paved over in a city. So the Project Fountain was really about what are we conscious of in the city, and what are we trained perceptually to see what is not there when actually it is there, it's hidden beneath the concrete. I'm going to end there and go to the next topic.
Actually, Laiwan, you actually touched upon the question I was hoping to get to later, but I think since you brought it up, the social and political impacts of your work, referencing the Fountain Project, I think maybe we can just go there for now. Tomoyo and Charwei and Farheen, I wonder if you can also talk about how do you think your experiences and your practices of working and living in all these different places across continents inform the practice to have the type of social and political impacts that you are hoping for, and what are those impacts?
What I've been doing wasn't intended to be social or political. It just happened by all the meetings, like this, Tibetan elderly. Because many people say, why Japanese person is doing about this particular project? It's not even project, it just happened to me. I explain briefly. So these people escaped Himalayan mountain, 1959, and they experienced such a hardship till they established back in India, and they really shared a sense of compassion and gave me lots of stories of their hardship. But what amazed me was they still have lots of sense of humor. Probably if you hit the bottom, only thing you can come up again is you keep your sense of humor. So they would laugh at, yeah, we try to sell these twigs to make a fire at the market. We didn't sell anything. And she said, we had 9 kids. And I thought, she told her husband, well, because we don't have education, we can't get a good job in India. We don't speak Hindi nor English, so let's send all the children to school as much as possible. So she would talk this kind of very painful story to me, but smiling. And then many times, this elderly, every Tibetan person, I met many younger people too, but what astonished me was not only, I know logically about this teaching of compassion, wisdom, thinking of others in a prayer, but they rarely showed it in action. So if there's a piece of bread and there's 5 people, everybody is hungry, every single person of them would share it into 5 pieces or separate to 4 pieces, and this person might skip eating that piece of bread. Then it's just permeated me, astonished me how much they carry out the core teaching of Buddhism or any religious tradition. I believe everything is the same. It's about sharing and feeling as if other people are your sister and brothers. Okay? So because of them, I become very sensitive to what is happening in Tibet. But I hear news in India. Then one year, 2012, there was a lot of protests called self-immolation happening in Tibet. And one day I just went to little cyber cafe. I was doing artist in residence in Orissa, eastern India. And then I was at the cyber cafe. It was my custom to check Tibetan social political situation online, often after 2008 Beijing Olympics. Many Tibetan people did a peaceful protest and they were killed. So after that, I was always checking. And I saw this picture of the one monk, Gushola, in a frame on a computer screen. And I started shaking. I couldn't bear. I started shaking at the cyber cafe in a little fisherman village. And I had to rush back to my residence room. And I draw one figure of half white, half red. And I had to do stitching with white thread and red thread. And I know that I felt so close to this particular group of people because of these people who took care of me. But that time was really dramatic because it didn't stop. I had a breakdown. So after that time, I started drawing about it. I couldn't help but drawing. And I still don't know the reason. And then gradually, 2012, 83 people died in self-immolation in Tibet. Every time I heard the news, I stayed in Dharamshala for 6 months that year in total. Whenever I heard the news, I read the story and I draw for this person because I felt such a strong sense of sadness and I wanted to feel their pain even a little bit. I know I can never understand their pain in a heat. And then I also felt quiet anger, actually. I thought, it's not fair this is happening. I want the world to know about it. And I want them to be remembered because they throw their body not only for themselves, screaming, please bring peace to my country for other people. Dalai Lama come back. Gyalwa Rinpoche, please come back, like that. So it has mixed feeling. But if I hadn't done it, I would crash again. So it was for me too. But to draw one thing was my tribute, my little contribution for each person, because often I felt they are not strangers. I felt they are my close brothers or sisters. And that was my beginning. Before, my theme was about cycle of dying and living, but not so particular. And it's changed direction of how I make art and how I live. And because of that drawing I've been doing for 7 years, now I'm involved with Taiwanese and Korean social history, where many people also are massacred in a protest. And all these things that I don't know how much impact, what art can make. But at least I think because my activism comes from totally personal place, it's happened because I felt to something so personally, but personal is universal. And if we try to find topic, social, political, like from intellectual level, it doesn't speak same way. Yeah, so it's just interesting coincidence that I happen to make art which touches lots of issues. Yeah, thank you.
For me, I guess it gradually evolved, because when I was a student, I guess I was not so exposed to social political issues as much as I was more focused on environmental issues. So I had a chance to go back to Taiwan in around 2012, where I was working with. I wanted to film this tribe in this group of indigenous people in an island. It's called Orchid Island, that is in the east coast of Taiwan, and the group there, the community there, they're actually closer linguistically to the Filipinos than to Taiwan, and it's a very remote island with very small population. So I think when the Kuomintang government with Chiang Kai-shek, when they came to Taiwan, and they started to want to develop, I guess they started to lose hope to go to conquer or to get back China. So they started to make a lot of developments within the island of Taiwan, including building nuclear power plants. And then so while they're looking for a place to store the nuclear waste, they decided to store it on this small island that's mostly inhabited by indigenous people. And finding out this, I understand this is happening all over the world, in the US and in different places where indigenous land gets used for this. But I was really shocked as a Taiwanese because our island is already so small and we're bullying an even smaller island. And when the government went on this island, they lied to the local people and said that they were building a fish cannery to support their economics because the nuclear waste storage container, it looks like kind of like a cannery. And but this island is probably one of the worst place geologically to store the waste because the constant erosion from the sea. So eventually the waste, these cans eroded, and then the waste seeped out to the ocean. And now there are generations of people that are born disabled because of the contamination. And so together with the Tibetan friend that I met in college, we made a small video work on this project, on this issue. And then later on, I had more opportunities where we also filmed, because my Tibetan friend, he's also from the refugee community in Dharamshala, so he grew up with this very strong sense of community, and also people going through very like similar situations. So we did a series of projects where which started in Nepal after the earthquake. It was 2 years after the earthquake in 2017, and then we came across a camp, a really huge camp with 3,000 people. So that people are still, like the government actually received $2 billion of foreign aid, but then the money was never distributed to these victims. So we came across this camp with 3,000 people that are still living in really horrible conditions in the winter. So we started to record songs from them. And then using songs as an expression of their situation. And then from this Nepal earthquake issue, I guess this work was seen by a curator in London. So I worked on another project in London with asylum seekers, women asylum seekers that are detained in the detention centers outside of London. And because in the UK, these detention centers are privatized to like multi-billion-dollar corporate companies, and the companies, they really don't care about the well-being of the asylum seeker, and kind of the longer they can keep them, the better it is for their business. So we ended up getting a rare access into the detention center, and also record songs from these women. And And I remember one song, it was sang by a woman from Kazakhstan, and I could just hear the mountains in her voice, even though I had no idea what she was singing about. And later on, I had it translated, and it was indeed about the mountains from her hometown. And then so these songs, they were, in the end, we projected very publicly on the London Royal Festival Hall, on the walls of the Royal Festival Hall, so that people from these different countries, like from Indonesia or from Eritrea in Africa and many different countries, when they walk by, they could hear the voices of these women and know that they're in this kind of situations. And then another really valuable thing I learned from this experience was going into the detention center. I was thinking that together with the charity groups, I was thinking that somehow we would be helping or supporting them in some ways. And then going in, I realized that these women, they have so much more life experience than I had, and they're so much stronger actually than I was. And I learned so much from this exchange. So from this experience, I realized, like, also that's taught in Buddhism, that it's much more of an interdependent relationship and less of just like one, like people trying to, or like one side trying to empower the other side, but it's a more mutual exchange. So so my practice in my art practice is kind of it appears to be two parts, where I have one part that's more introspective, was like my own personal understanding of Buddhism and studying through the sutra writing, and then the other side that is more social. But I guess they're all integrated, and I feel like I keep learning through the opportunities that I'm getting with these exhibitions.
Laiwan, something you said really struck a chord for me, which is you're interested in liberation. I was like, yay, I love that word, and it's so aspirational for me. But I think coming back to that kind of question around, like, who am I? Why am I here? What is the human condition? Those yearnings to kind of dig into those questions are an aspiration and a yearning for liberation, to something kind of bigger. And one of my teachers that I've been kind of studying, and I've sat with Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who's a Zen teacher, queer Black teacher from New York City. She talks about liberation, that like we cannot have liberation for ourselves. My liberation actually hinges on everyone else being liberated. So it's not like I can get to the finish line and I'm good. That we actually all have to undergo the process of liberation together. And for me, that's such a great reminder of the politics of Dharma and the social justice being woven into practice. And so when I think about my work and these kind of inquiry questions and this yearning, the best place I can start is with myself. It's that, like this is the relative reality. Like I have this form, this body, but the hope is to get so personal that it resonates on a universal level, and that's the tricky balance, and that's the work. I think whether it's aesthetically in the art or spiritually in how I move in the world, it's to be in that place, as I'm remembering like Kay's lecture last night, like that zero, right? Between, like that empty place between the two different realities. And what that's looking like in my practice, just by example, is, these questions, like what does it mean to be here? Politically, for me, the TRC commissions, the TRC commission, and this moment of reconciliation that we've been in Canada, these conversations have been a huge part of my practice. And so I ask myself, what does it mean to be here as a settler on Lekwungen territory, as a Muslim, a Buddhist, and what are these practices? How do they intersect with practices here, and how do they emerge and take shape? And so a few years ago, I started asking, like, how can conversation be my medium? Because I was finding I was just wanting to talk to people and listen. And recently, I did a collaborative piece with Charles Campbell and Bradley Dick, both Victoria artists. Charles Campbell is Jamaican-Canadian, Bradley Dick is Lekwungen artist and knowledge keeper. And we were interested in being basically just present on the land, seeing what arose, and just asking the question, how do we arrive here? In this moment, how do we arrive in our practices, and kind of keeping a very open-ended container and question. And that resulted eventually in a piece, but there were a few iterations where we gathered community to come and sit in contemplation on the shoreline, using the shoreline of Dallas Road as a metaphor, as a place of arrival. And after sitting in silence, listening, kind of deeply listening to each other around what comes up. And then you'll see the copper slide with the copper installation hanging, and created this opportunity for people to come into the gallery space and either sit or lay down, and to look up at the ground. The piece was called The Ground Above Us, and to listen to this audio track that was a composition of the various conversations that took place over the course of 6 months, which have included probably about 45 people, various seals and sea lions and birds and hawks in water, and that's an ongoing project. And then the other example I'll just give quickly is there's also a slide moving in the rotation around with me uncovering like a white shroud. And the question of what does it mean to be here, and this kind of moment of reconciliation has also really led me to self-reconciliation, which I think is the Dharma and Buddhist practice really affords us, and is such an amazing, generous container to do this work in, and also personal and familial reconciliation for me. So the piece with the white shroud is a 140-pound sculptural floor work that I performatively install in the gallery, and it emerged from work that I did with my mother over the course of a year around the grief and kind of lost time in the ways that I've internalized patriarchy and basically failed to see her and to honor her and uphold her. And it was a way, and is still a way for me to kind of make amends, to acknowledge the pain and the kind of intergenerational kind of ways that I kind of carry on the violence, particularly around women in our world. And I feel like art is, my kind of encapsulating thought is like, those are just some examples, but the politics can be global and personal. And I can see how this kind of work that I've been able to do through meditation practice and social justice work is like working through my family and through myself, and thus my community. And it's art that's allowed us to kind of come to these hard places. So like in my family, I was only able to do this work because I was like, Mom, do you want to like have some conversations and can we explore this stuff? And everybody wants to be involved in an art project, right? And so I could have some really difficult conversations with my mom and ask her questions, but there was this like safe third space to work in. And even with the ground above us, asking, these are hard conversations. What does it mean to be here? amongst, as racialized bodies, mixed race folks, settlers, those of us who are we have this huge reclamation work to do, and this kind of remembrance that we want to do together. And so the place of art and creation is just such a huge potentiality, and a place where we get to rebuild as opposed to deconstructing. We get to reimagine our world.
Thank you. Thanks. So we're going to open it up very soon. But before we do that, can I ask each of you just use 2 minutes to talk about going back to the theme of this panel, and just to talk about how you came with different Asian cultural backgrounds where Buddhism had a very different presence and deep presence than what is usually in the West. And but you yourselves have very rich experiences of being trained and then working and exhibiting in North American and all these other continents. So I was wondering, in these increasingly transcultural and globalized context, how do you feel like you have integrated practices of Buddhism in a Western setting with your reconnection or modification of your traditional or cultural upbringing of Buddhism or other type of understanding? So each of you has 2 minutes, except for Laiwan, who can reference one more work, because I'm sorry.
That I can reference one more work, did you say? Thank you. I don't think I've ever been a good Chinese person, because I was raised in the colonies, and I wasn't raised Buddhist, but I was raised with spaciousness and slowness and familial love. And I think those things carry through. The other thing I was raised with was a really Taoist understanding of flow, and how do we really kind of listen to what is flowing. So in relation to a project, perhaps recently in summer, I was invited to do a show at Art Speak, which is a gallery in Vancouver. And I really try and listen to the site specificity of each project. So Art Speak is in a corner, a square that's called Maple Tree Square. And so Maple Tree Square is when the first city council meetings happened of the first settlers in Vancouver. That tree no longer exists, but it's a very old maple tree that was there. So in honor of that tree, I created a project in my mind called Maple Tree Spiral. And my idea was to access the City of Vancouver database of all the city trees, because I wanted to do a project that acknowledged the work of city trees. And from the database, create a map in a spiral of all the maple trees. What happened was, somehow the city was sending leaflets saying, we're going to cut down this maple tree on Water Street. And I said, I want that tree. I don't want them to cut it down, but if they're going to cut it down, I want the tree. So the project, it's one of the slides that were there. There were 18, 19 pieces from that maple tree, and then the project evolved from that dear tree. So often with a project, I don't know what's going to happen. I just follow with what arises, and it arose that tree was being cut. Because of the angle it was growing, it was considered dangerous to pedestrians and cars. So part of the work was to work with the city arborists and to work with the City of Vancouver. And I see that relationship building, that site specificity, also working with Indigenous artist Tzu-I, who told stories about the Squamish in that area before it became Gastown, etc. There was how do we reconcile these spaces, and how do we listen to these stories that surface, that counters perhaps the colonial stories. So one of the things that came out of that, or not because it came out of that, but one of the things that arose was the statue of Gassy Jack. So Gassy Jack was a saloon owner who's now he's named, Gastown is after him, and there's a statue there. So one of the questions with the Cultural Services Department of the City of Vancouver is, should Gassy Jack stay there? Should that statue remain there? So I think part of the meditative practice that I invite audiences to my projects is to consider the site-specific questions that arise, and in what ways can we make peace with not only this tree that has lost its life, but also the deeper history, the deep time, the deep space, the deep bodies that have lived here for millennia, and it's not just about, our rushing around in this spot. So that's, I don't know, did that answer the question?
The question is about
what have you done in your global experiences to integrate your
old custom.
old world
Okay. As I follow Laiwan, I'm not really good Japanese person. And I basically came to Canada to get out from there. And the thing is, when I came to North America, it's especially Canada is mosaic. It had so many people with so many different history. So it helped me to open up, and also gave me capacity to study Buddhism. Because in Japan, if we study something religious, people might think, oh, she's like a bit weird, yeah? New Age. So North America to be in Canada was, I think, necessary for me to open up, to have a totally open ending, and to whatever the good value comes in. So rather than going back to my own identity, I feel I don't have any identity actually. I become kind of borderless. And also because I travel around and people call me vagabond. So that's how I feel. But I've been going back to Korea and Taiwan to deal with their own social issue. And it's like Taiwan and Korea have lots of similarity with where I grew up in terms of the value about the community, the value about how to think of others. And it's quite, it's not individualism, it's about the group mentality in a good or bad way. So by being back there, after going back to India so many times, I went to India 20 times before I went to Taiwan and Korea, I find my old value of being in a group and harmonious in a good old way. And also I see the critical part in Japanese society now. It's not always positive, but often I find a good value which might have been lost in Japan, in those countries that I've been, although I don't know how deeply I understood. Wait, does it answer the question? So I take a good part, anything from each culture, yeah? But I see more problems in my own society right now, where I grew up. And I have lots of concern, too. But I cannot make art yet about it because I don't have direct personal, deep experience yet. But thank you.
For me, it's been really helpful to study Buddhism, as I mentioned before, in the U.S. in English, because a lot of words that we take for granted, it helps me to challenge it again. For example, even the most simple word like mind, In Chinese, when I read in English, I always associate it with the brain, and then but in Chinese, it's written as heart. So then it helps me to question then what is mind, and or like the word emptiness in Chinese, 空, it also means spaciousness. So it expands on these definitions that's like seems to be obvious and simple words, but actually there are many layers in the Buddhist context. And also with my practice of calligraphy, I felt like I could have much more freedom here, because when I'm writing in Taiwan, there's such a sophisticated tradition of Chinese calligraphy already that people really focus on the correctness of each character. Well, of course, like when I write it, it's correct, but it's not the traditional like very precise way of learning it. But since my interest is not in the craft of calligraphy, but it's more the expression of writing, of contemplating on the sutra, on ephemeral materials, and contemplating on impermanence. So I'm not focused on the art of calligraphy, which I feel like I have more room to explore working in the West. And so that's kind of my experience working here.
I find it very exciting to be practicing Buddhism as a Muslim here in Victoria on the Kwanghan territory. This is it. Like the complexity and intersection of experiences is so available in the way that the Dharma and the sort of the lineage that I've been studying under Theravada Buddhism, which was brought over by like Jewish teachers who went to Burma and India in the 60s and then brought it back to Barre, Massachusetts, and then to Marin County. And through that lineage, it has taught teachers that I'm kind of studying kind of the third and fourth iteration kind of teachers who are like queer, Black, Muslim, Hindu, just the range, queer, trans. And so to me, that is the most exciting and rich place of practice. I'm not a very good Pakistani or Indian Muslim, according to my parents. They tell me that all the time. And yet, they also, there's something in because I can study with teachers, kind of this broad array of teachers that kind of reflect my experience of being here and being kind of, like you talk about being borderless, Tomoyo. I think that's more and more everyone's experience. So many of us are either displaced or have been settlers for many generations. Like, it's very rare, and it can be a privilege to have generations of connection to a piece of land, but that's rarer. I was having a conversation with somebody here earlier today with Paul about that, and I think this is the potentiality of the kind of borderless and the conversation that happens between practices. And it's like the image that comes to my mind is like Indra's net, that beautiful kind of web where each intersection is this facet, this jewel, and it reflects every other facet within it. And that's what I hold on to and think we're in this moment, and I think in this kind of, the more there is sharing, it's kind of sparkling and it's possible. So.
I think what you're saying is each of you creates new frameworks as you work through different projects. This is not working. Okay, I need to stand up because we're gonna open this to the floor, and these are the 4 fabulous artists here. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Anybody? Please go.
Hi, thank you. I thought this was such an exciting panel because of the sort of the effortlessness of the diasporic body to navigate all of these experiences. You know, I'm also just picking up from what you said, Farheen, also as a Muslim who practices Buddhism. I've been questioning a lot lately the boundaries that we work within. You know, on one hand, there's a struggle between, let's say, a felt notion of syncretism, of like, you know, as artists, we have the capacity to make connections that go beyond very siloed academic historical analyses of religion. But on the other hand, there's critique and pitfalls of becoming like, for example, like a theosophist who, you know, would wildly combine, you know, different traditions. So I'm just curious, and it's more of a question to help me work that out as well. Have you struggled with notions of authenticity in the face of, or authenticity to Buddhism, in the face of a desire to make these connections with your larger, very diverse religious and migration experiences?
And then maybe you, Laiwan. Thanks for the question, Samir. Absolutely, I have struggled. So yes, and my evolution around, so I'm picking up like around authenticity to Buddhism, and yeah, you know, we worry about like you don't want to just dabble and like just throw things together, and where I'm at, and I've been having recently some very open and very difficult conversations with my staunchly Orthodox father around my practice and what it looks like, both Muslim and Buddhist. And I just keep thinking about, like, I do know from my, and I feel like a newbie in my study, in my learning around Buddhism, and even though I've grown up with Islamic teachings, what I do know that I feel like through and through is that there's this spaciousness and ability, and actually it's woven into the teachings of both Buddhism and Islam around the spaciousness of truth. Like Buddhism is, for me anyways, a philosophy. It is a way of practicing, and within it, like I have no worry that anymore that I can't be Buddhist and Muslim, because my meditation practice and the way the psychology of Buddhism has space for various rituals and practice, and the less legalistic approach to Islam also holds that. My family has a history of Sufi practice, and that is, there is such a connection and the same kind of spaciousness that is afforded that can hold the legalities within it.
Thank you, Farheen. That was very well said. I think that, and thank you, Samir, for the question. I think one of the things that I wrestle with within, say, a spiritual practice is the logical, intellectual mind that questions our deepest good. And in what ways can we keep reaffirming that we are a shining light that just needs to allow the light to shine? And rather I personally approach Buddhism not as a religion, as a philosophy, but something that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges, say as a teacher, is how to provide students with an agility, with being at peace, with their whatever can bring the light forth, or whatever. If we look at all the good books of all the different religions, they all advocate for, a deep, abiding love for life, but also how to just celebrate your brilliance, brilliance in the most humble way, in the sense that we need more light in the world. There's a lot of darkness, and that seems to be the teaching with nearly every religion, which is, in what ways do you bring forth the brilliance? And again, I say that in the most humble way, to remind where the abundance is. Like, there's so much about colonialism and capitalism that's all about scarcity, but in any given moment, there's millions of miracles happening, You can look at a little caterpillar and there's a miracle happening. So how do we remind ourselves of that, and how do we remind others of that? So for myself, to reconcile some of the questions that often I have, saying that, oh, but I'm not an expert in this. I always have to just go back to what is the real spiritual quest here? And the spiritual quest is to shine, and to be reminded of the abundance of miracles that happen in any given moment.
Yes. Thank you for the question. About struggling about being authentic in terms of Buddhism, that was the question, right? Yeah. I don't practice deep enough, and I always thought that how much I have practiced. But I'm very simple about strategy of making art. Number one, it have to come from heart. It have to be honest. And as Laiwan said, I agree. It's about finding little light in a most humble way. Humbleness is really important to me, to the point people don't realize my name. It's okay. But whatever I can do in a subtle way can open up somebody's heart. I don't think it's so important to be so authentic. And I don't approach Buddhism in an intellectual or logical way too much, because it comes and it goes. I'm not really good. When I listen to Dharma talk, sometimes I go like this. What was it about? Yeah. And then also, what was something I really wanted to say? I forgot. But anyway, if I stick to what is authentic too much, in a Buddhism, each person have different paths. Core teaching is the same. So as every spiritual religious tradition, it's always going back to liberation, light, sharing, equanimity. So I try not to think if I'm authentically Buddhist or not too much. Then I go back to my childhood experience of how to be well-behaved Buddhist in Japanese standard, which I wasn't. And the art is, how can I say, it is about talking about the subtlety. It's a subtle mind and a subtle personal experience which lead to everybody. So then authenticity in, Buddhism is about liberation and open ending, so it doesn't really matter to me. Does it make sense? Yeah? Okay.
For me, recently, I've been somehow invited to 3 very different places, like in Mongolia, to do projects. So in Mongolia, in Indonesia, and in Koyasan in Japan. So I was trying to kind of figure out how these three places connect with my own practice. And then I found this map that traces the spread of Vajrayana from, which is the Tantric Buddhist tradition, from Nalanda University in India. And I found on this map that the furthest north of the influence is to Mongolia, and the furthest south is to Java and Sumatra, Indonesia, and the furthest east is towards Koyasan in Japan. So, so the way I find, but for example, in Mongolia, Buddhism is very much mixed with shamanism, and in Indonesia, it's now mostly a Muslim country, but they still have some Javanese, ancient wisdom tradition that are still being practiced. So I guess there are two factors I look into trying to understand their connection with their ancient wisdom connection with Buddhism. For me, it's the non-duality and compassion. So these are the two major areas that I look to connect into these ancient wisdoms in the different areas that I'm working in.
Hi. Just a follow-up on what Samir was talking about, and it's kind of a general question, not directed at anyone on the panel. It could be for everyone to discuss, but I'm kind of thinking through what are the responsibilities and protocols that we need to take on when we claim to represent these ideologies. I work in Richmond, BC, and so to do a Buddhist project in Richmond is in certain ways a political act, that Buddhism is a institutional religion that is harnessed by capitalist and governmental forces. And within Richmond, there are many temples that have been built by some of the most rich and powerful people in the world, and are used as, at times, to, I don't know what the proper word, to clean money, like to launder money, or to used as a site of propaganda. So I get a bit antsy sometimes around just thinking about, what an institution or an artist, what are our sort of responsibilities to and protocols when kind of engaging with these very complex ideologies that are harnessed in very positive ways, but also there are communities that may have very traumatic responses or experiences in relation to ideas around Buddhism.
If I could say something, I think the question of protocols and ethics is always an important one in terms of the responsibilities, particularly as visitors to unceded land. So the question about what are the protocols is to, as an administrator in an institution like the Richmond Art Gallery, I think it would be wise to get many counselors, a council, to advise you on how to proceed with with such a project, but also indigenous councils. But I'm always learning about protocols, and this protocol is, I think, really important in terms of truth and reconciliation. In all ways, because I think in every institution there are the launderers and the appropriators, and how do we work past that and get back to truth?
And just to ask that question and to keep asking it is also part of the process. So if one doesn't know, then like you're saying, Laiwan, we ask around. And I think part of when and how we get stuck is we think, oh, I should know, and then if we don't know, we just don't do anything. So reaching out, asking the communities that are involved or maybe impacted by, that's what elders do and did in many cultures and continue to, and we don't know. So I think the question in itself is maybe the answer. And once we think we know what the protocols are, we keep revisiting because they do, because protocols change as well.
I think the problems when spirituality becomes institutionalized is actually very similar to when art becomes institutionalized. And I guess it's, on the one hand, the institutions, they give more access to more people who can be involved in art or in spiritual practice. And but on the downside would be power abuse or corruption. And so I guess it's also up to the individuals to be really careful when they enter into an institution. And again, to question it.
Just a response to your question, Sean. It's I think people will find a way to politicicize any of the ideas anyway. To give you an example, I was invited to do a tea ceremony for kids, like for elementary school students. So I served grade 3 and grade 5 combined class together. There's 60 of them. And I was wondering, does kid like to drink tea? And so I have a helper and did a tea ceremony. And it turns out they love to drink tea. They cannot have in love of it. So part of my tea practice is I also combine a bit of a meditation, because you need to be aware of the present moment when you receive the sensational. And at the end, we get complaints by the parents. So that's a religion's event, and it's so that's what we get. So so the short answer is I don't know how to address this sort of polarization of political view. I think people have a tendency to turn this into political thing. But so the protocol is a bit of tough question, but maybe to do this kind of show, we just do it vague, like kind of vague idea, because I think there's something. It's universal in Buddhism, so whatever way you look at it, because that's why it's so popular, because it addresses basic universal human emotions, and especially in the area of suffering and compassion. So I think that is impermanent in all religions. So rather than say it's a Buddhist show, it's about something else. Yeah, more universal. No.
Thank you for that comment. I'm just going to conclude by saying that, sure, there's no one fit for all, like no protocol, no set of rules that apply for all. But our artists here have demonstrated the flexibilities and also, the opening up of mindsets and frameworks to work with in a lot of different complex projects and also in different contexts across different continents. I think that's very impressive. So can we have a round of applause to thank our artists? And to thank Hema and the art gallery, Marina, Janelle, for putting this together so successfully for us.
So that concludes our proceedings today, and thank you all so much for being here. We'll be starting back again tomorrow morning in the chapel, and Tina Pearson is going to take us through a deep listening workshop, which I think will be really amazing to reset ourselves. But thank you all so much for a wonderful panel and some great conversation, and I look forward to continuing again tomorrow. Thank you.